Hello you guys, my name is Oksana and welcome to my video tutorials about photography. We will start from the basics. Three very important things which make a good exposure are aperture, shutter speed and ISO. Let me show you what I mean by those things. Inside every lens there is an opening through which light travels into the camera. That opening called aperture. Inside the camera there is a shutter, which is like a door, which opens and lets light into the camera while you're taking a picture, and then it closes again. And actually we can control how long the shutter remains open. The time how long the shutter remains open called shutter speed. And inside the camera there is also, inside the film camera there is a film, and inside the digital camera there is a sensor. And actually sensitivity of the sensor to light called ISO. In this tutorial we're going to talk about aperture in more details. Let's get started. Aperture is a hole or an opening inside the lens through which light travels into the camera. It controls how much light gets into the camera. The smaller the opening, the less light gets into the camera. And of course, the bigger the opening, the more light gets into the camera. You can control the size of the aperture by changing f-stops in the camera. You can see f-stops on the screen or in your viewfinder. Let me show you the aperture switch on the camera. For Nikon cameras, the aperture switch is usually right here. To be able to change the aperture value, let's set our camera into manual mode. This is manual mode. Let's check out our aperture. Here is the f-stops for aperture, and as we turn this dial, our aperture value is changing. You can also find your aperture value in the live view on the screen or when you look through your viewfinder. What the f-stop actually stands for? F-stop equals the focal length of the lens divided by the aperture opening of the lens. And now comes the part which makes a lot of people confused, because you have to think backwards. So, actually, the bigger the f number, the smaller the opening. And the smaller the f number, the bigger the opening. As you can see on the picture, opening for f22 is actually smaller than opening for f2. Here is something I would recommend you to memorize. Those are full f-stops. You will understand later why it is so important to remember them. Once again, as you can see on the picture, the smaller the number, the bigger the opening, and the bigger the number, the smaller the opening. It is also important to remember that every previous stop lets twice as much light into the camera as the next one. This way, f1.4 lets twice as much light as f2, and f2 lets twice as much light as f2.8, and so on. You should also know that some modern cameras can also display half of the stop or even 1/3 of the stop between full stops. Here we have f11. f11 is a full stop. The next full stop is f16, but if I dial this aperture switch, instead of f16 I will get f13, and then f14, and only then f16. Remember, every previous stop lets twice as much light as the next one, so f11 lets twice as much light as f16. But what if I don't want to let twice as much light? I want to adjust my aperture just a little bit. Then I will use those stops in between. You should also know that different lenses have a different range of aperture. Here, a couple of prime lenses. As you can see, the different prime lenses have a different range of aperture. I showed you the prime lenses. Now let's take a look at the zoom lens. I have 18 to 200 mm lens right here. Let's take a look what is aperture for this lens. The widest aperture for this lens is 3.5. Let's take a look what is the smallest aperture. The smallest aperture is f22. But let's try something. Let's try to use zoom. Let's zoom this lens to 200. Let's see what happened to the aperture. So, our smallest aperture changed to f36 and our biggest aperture changed to f5.6. So it means that aperture in the zoom lenses also depends on the focal length of the lens. F-stop or aperture influence the depth of field. But what does depth of field means? Depth of field is the distance between the nearest and the furthest object in a scene, what appears sharp or is in focus in the image. Everybody should remember this. The bigger the f number, the smaller the opening and more depth of field. So it means more of the scene appears in focus. And the smaller the f number, the bigger the opening and the less depth of field. So it means that less of the subject or the scene appears in focus. Here are some examples for better understanding. For this image I used f22, so my opening was pretty small. As you can see, the whole image, foreground and background, appears in focus. So I would say that I had broad depth of field in this image, so everything appears in focus. Here is another image of the same subject, but in this case I used f4, so my opening was pretty big. As you can see, not everything in the image appears to be in focus. I was focusing on the mailbox, so my mailbox is in focus, but background is blurry, so out of focus. It means that because of my big opening, I have a shallow depth of field in this image, so not everything appears in focus. Let's summarize everything we learned today. We were talking about aperture. Aperture is an opening inside the lens through which light travels into the camera. And we can control the size of the aperture by changing f-stops or f-numbers inside the camera. And the bigger actually the f-number, the smaller the opening going to be. And the smaller the f number, the bigger the opening. By aperture, you can also control your depth of field. Depth of field indicates how much of the image appears in focus. If I have a wide aperture, it means that we're gonna have a shallow depth of field. So not everything in image appears in focus. So if I take a picture of myself and focus on my face might be in focus, but the background is gonna be out of focus. And if I have a small aperture, it means that I can get more scene in focus. If I take a picture of myself, I will get the background in focus as well. I hope this tutorial was helpful for you, and I hope to see you next time in my next video tutorial about shutters. Bye bye!